So what happened in prison? Talk us through a typical day.
Yeah, a typical day. I mean, you'd be woken up for breakfast, and so you'd have to go and get your trays. And so you'd go and grab your trays and bring them up to your cell, and you'd have breakfast, and you'd have to eat your food pretty quick because you had to return your trays at a particular time. And so, there isn't a lot of time to eat pretty fast. And then you're just kind of waiting for your exercise to take place. I mean, you're waiting for about 3 times a day. You would get out for an hour at a time, and on those hours you'd be making phone calls. I would talk to my wife an awful lot. You might get a little bit of time outside, though it was cold. There was a concrete cube where you could play some basketball, and you would talk with the guys a little bit. There was radio in your cell, so you would listen to the radio. When I was on my own, and there was a period of time when I was on my own, I would spend more time in the Word and in prayer. That became more difficult with a cellmate, although sometimes I would read him the Word of God. I remember reading him Daniel 3, for example. And as I read Daniel 3, just a plain read, he was like, man, that sounds a lot like what you guys are going through right now. And so he just plain reading of Daniel 3, and he's recognizing the comparison between what we were going through and what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. So that was more or less your day revolved around your food and your exercise and the phone calls that you would make, and whatever access you had to the radio. And that was important too, because the radio had talk radio on it, so they were oftentimes talking about me and our church. And so I would, on Sundays, for example, I'd be eagerly awaiting what the news was going to say about Grace Life Church, because I wanted to know how things were going. And if I couldn't talk to my wife until I was out on exercise. And so I'd be waiting to find out what would happen and all of that. And so that was kind of how life was like once we got into general population. Initially, though, I was in quarantine. So for the first about 16 days, I was in quarantine where I could only get out twice a day for 15 minutes. And so you would spend a lot of time, 23 and a half hours a day in your cell. And so that was challenging, but I was on my own. So I could really make that time count and spend that time well and productively initially. And yeah, that just basically describes the way things went. There was one day where I was in my cell, I think for nearly 24 hours without an exercise. And so that's a little, cubicle that you're in for, 24 hours. But, I could have just gotten up and walked to the desk and said, I'm ready to sign my condition, or and I probably couldn't have done that because I couldn't get out of my cell, but I could have just hit the buzzer and spoke to the guards, and said, I'm ready to sign my condition and leave. And they would send guards to me daily. How you doing? Have you given any thought to signing your condition or any, and they wanted me to. They didn't want me there. I figured that out really early on. They did not want me in prison. It was not helpful for them. They wanted me out. And so I figured that out pretty early on. And that was actually comforting, because that meant that my associate pastor, Jacob Spence, and even Tim Stevens at that time were probably safe. They weren't going to use the same tool on them that they had used on me, because they didn't want the same thing to happen. And so that was actually somewhat helpful to figure that out and be able to relay that to them and be comforted that maybe my being in prison will actually keep them out, at least initially. And so, that kind of captures the way life was like in prison.
Wow. Growing up, you would have watched lots of movies, involving prison. But how much of that is realistic? I mean, a lot of people listening right now and watching you, James, would have only have those as reference points as well. Was there a sense of danger? Did you feel like your life was in danger with the other inmates? Was there a sense of that, or was you confident that you were okay?
At times there were. I mean, obviously, as I was coming in, I didn't know what to expect on any level, and so I got a word of comfort from one inmate as I was coming into the facility, and he said, "You're going to be just fine. Don't worry." And surprisingly enough, that was actually comforting. And then as I was being transitioned prior to being transitioned from being in quarantine to general population, there was certainly some consternation around that, because there were some conversations taking place, and this is where the spiritual battle, I think, comes into play, where guards and inmates were, I wouldn't say they were trying to scare me. That could be the case, but they were having conversations with me that certainly had me concerned. And I tell that in the book as well, and how the Lord delivered me from that fear. And he was very good and gracious to do that, almost like a Daniel moment with, an angel being sent, at the moment of his prayer to be ministered to and strengthened. The Lord did that through a chaplain in the prison cell, when in the prison itself. And then, when I got into GP, there was an altercation that resulted in the prison itself. And as soon as that altercation took place, you could just tell that there was a greater tension in the building. And so I certainly sensed a little bit of, concern at that particular time, in terms of just everyone being on edge a little bit. And so I was aware of that. I grew up in a portion of Toronto where I had accumulated a degree of street sense. And so going into prison, it's not like I was completely, it was a different world in many respects, but I wasn't entirely being exposed to an element I'd never seen before. And so I had a degree of street sense that were with me, which I think was helpful and assisted me to be able to relate to the inmates well. And I think that was beneficial. So, but yeah, there were some moments for sure where I was slightly aware of just the danger that could be, for sure.